Okay, welcome everyone. This is our second class in our new mini-series, Exploring the Soul. I'm going to do a quick review of what we learned last week. It's always good to review, and especially for people who weren't there. But we started by really looking at the story of creation and trying to understand the first time the word soul is used. And we learned that there are 5 levels of the soul: the nephesh, which is called the animal soul, the part of the soul most connected to the body, literally to the blood of our bodies; the ruach, which is the spirit or the emotional component of a human being; the neshama, the intellectual; the chaya, the bridge between conscious and supraconscious levels, especially will, ratzon. And the highest level is called yechidah, the unique point of godliness within a human being. And we went through the fish and the birds and the crawling insects, and then the land animals and the domesticated animals, and then finally human beings. And we see that all of them are called nefesh chaya, a living, the way Art Scroll says it, a living, one second. A living being is the way that the Art Scroll says nefesh chaya. So we discussed the idea of different levels of consciousness, different levels of soul. And we saw that in the text, there is something unique about a human being. One, it's the only creation that it says explicitly that it was created in the image of God. And it's the only one where God blew into the nostrils of the Adam, the first human being, and it became a living soul. So none of the others mention about a neshama. And this idea of blowing into the soul, we discussed that was like the ruach. Because ruach literally means wind. And blowing in the ruach and the neshama. And then we saw that the human beings called the nefesh chaya. These are the first and the fourth levels of the soul. And because God was blowing, as it were, from his insides, from his essence, so that is the yechidah in the soul. So we see in the text of creation, 3 of them are explicit, 3 of the levels, nefesh, neshama, and chaya, and 2 of them are very strongly alluded to, ruach and yechidah. So today I want to continue with exploring the idea of soul in the biggest context that we can. And we don't really have time to go into it. I invite everyone to do your own Google searches. But in the last 20, 25, 30 years, there's been a tremendous amount of research and really delving deeply into all levels of creation to see if there is consciousness. This is actually a very, very big part of quantum physics today. We've discussed this before in different contexts, but quantum physics is, in fact, the cutting edge of quantum physics is the role of consciousness in creation, the role of the observer in creation. And again, without going into all of the research, some of it is not accepted by everyone. There's tremendous discussion and even disagreements about different levels of creation if they have consciousness. But there is a lot of scientific people who are doing research who are coming to the conclusion that the first life, we started this evening talking about the fish and the birds and the reptiles, and then the land animals, and then humans. But on the third day already was created vegetation. And vegetation is alive, that's for sure. The question is, does it have consciousness? And so again, I invite everyone to do your Google searches, and you'll see there's tremendous disagreements, but there's been a lot of research done. And many people feel that the vegetable plane of existence not only has life, but it has a certain level of consciousness. And right now, I'm going to take a minute and just give over the definitions of consciousness that you could find in a dictionary or online. And there's obviously a very, very deep connection between soul and consciousness. So what I got, and there are many shades of this kind of definition, but consciousness is awareness of the mind of itself and the world around it. So we know that the vegetable kingdom has a tremendous power of growth. And it's definitely alive. The question is, does it have consciousness? So within consciousness, there are different levels, and this is where the disagreement comes. One of the levels of consciousness is called fundamental awareness and response. And that's a type of consciousness. In other words, it's clear from the research that plants react to different stimuli. Whether it could be music, it could be people speaking to it, it could be a fire in the area that might burn down the vegetation. There is different, not predators, but different dangers, whether it's drought or flood. And they see that through the roots, that especially through the roots, that the vegetable kingdom, there is what's called a fundamental awareness of the world around it, and then there's a response. In other words, just like anything that's alive, the plant world is hardwired for survival. So if there's a drought, the plants are aware of it, and they will change their whole inner being to deal with the drought in order to stay alive. So some say this, we don't want to call this consciousness. We don't want to say that plants have some kind of a soul. But others say that they're convinced that plants don't just respond, but they could even think one step ahead. And again, I invite everyone to do research. Like I say, it's not conclusive, and there's much disagreement about it, but it's a fascinating area. I remember in the 1960s, I think the first book that came out doing research on this was called The Secret Life of Plants. It was a revolutionary book because no one really had done research to see, do plants have consciousness? We know they're alive, but does that mean that they have, as it were, soul qualities, consciousness? Now, you might also have read that there's been a lot of research about water and water's ability to have a memory and water's ability to be a conduit for consciousness. We know that the human body, depending what what research you see is anywhere from 70 to 90% made of water. And that includes the brain. And so, again, there's been a lot of research how water reacts to different stimuli. And if water has not only a memory, but can be a conduit for consciousness itself. And then lastly, amazingly, and this is coming from modern quantum physics, there seems to be proof that atoms and molecules are able not just to respond to stimuli, but to actually make certain choices. They've done many, many experiments, and no one understands how exactly this works, but it appears in certain research that atoms can make choices. So I'm mentioning all of this, and there is a new, call it discipline within science called panpsychism. And this has many followers who feel that everything of creation has consciousness, has a certain level of soul, certain level of soul. Again, soul and consciousness are very, very connected. So I gave a definition of consciousness that you could find online or in a dictionary. Soul, of course, is very difficult to come up with a definition of soul, because by definition, it supersedes, it transcends the physical world. And once you're out of the physical world, it becomes harder and harder to identify and define things. But a typical kind of definition for soul is it is a spiritual, non-physical entity that animates an animating essence or energy that gives really life to an entity, to a human being. So when they do research on the brain, to this day, they don't really understand what conscious is, because the problem is we know that the brain in a sense, is the center of what we'll call consciousness, but they really don't know how the quantum leap from a physical brain and synapses and electric messages is able to create as it were, a spiritual entity called consciousness and memory. They're still researching this because they don't quite understand how consciousness works, how the soul works, as it were. In future classes, we will be looking at Kabbalistic and Hasidic ideas of what the soul is and how it works. But our discussion about what the Torah says is the basis of our belief in what the soul is, that it's in the image of God, and it was specifically blown into a human being from God, and it's called the Nishmat Hayim. It's something that nothing else in creation has. So there's no doubt that human consciousness is far above the animal world, if the vegetable world kingdom has, and if the mineral world has. But there are different teachings from the Arizal and the Baal Shem Tov that allude very, very strongly that this idea, which we just call panpsychism, that it is a reality, that there are different levels of consciousness, different levels of soul in all of the created world. Now, it doesn't mean that our level of consciousness or soul is like a tree, but there's an awareness that it's not that a tree just grows, that there's something much, much deeper. Actually, there's a famous story of Rabbi Nachman, that one time he was traveling and he stayed over in the house of, I don't know if it was a follower or a contemporary, and he couldn't sleep all night. And he just tossed and turned in the bed. And in the morning, he got up and he said, "What's the story with this bed?" And so the man said, "Oh, it's a brand new bed. I just, in the last few days, I just cut down these very, very young trees, and I made this bed." And Rabbi Nachman said, now I understand. I was hearing the crying of these young trees the whole night. So we could take that as like an allegory or a metaphor or very fanciful. But now we're going to introduce something that many people know, what's called Perek Shira. Perek Shira is an ancient midrash that there's no real explanation, but there are 70 different creations. There's the sun and the moon and the stars and rivers and mountains and grain fields and trees and fish and birds and animals and insects. And it has the full range of creation, from the mineral, vegetable, animal, and not human though. Those three, and it just says what song they're singing. So Perek Shira means really the chapter of song. And according to tradition, it was compiled, written by David HaMelech, King David, and maybe Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech. So here we have 70 creations, and they're all singing. They're all singing. So I learned from Rav Ginsburg that there's actually 4 opinions who is singing these songs. So one opinion is it's the creations themselves, because each of the creations has a level of consciousness. And the verse that it sings, I'd say of the 70 creations that are mentioned, about half of them actually mention the name of the creation in the verse that they're singing. But another half, there are verses that we ponder, why is this creation saying this verse? And there's been many, many commentaries written, especially in the last 20, 30 years. It's become a very popular subject of study, Perek Shira. But the underlying idea here is that every plane, every level of creation has a level of consciousness. So Rabbi Ginsburg says that's the first possibility of who's singing the song. The second one is based on an idea in the Talmud that says a blade of grass does not grow unless its angel, we'll call it its guardian angel, hits it and says, grow. So what this means is that we have what's called the macrocosm and the microcosm. And we have the upper worlds and the lower worlds. We have what's called the heavenly Jerusalem and the earthly Jerusalem. We have the part of the soul that manifests itself in this world. And we have the root of the soul that actually remains above. This we will go into deeper explanation of. And so the angel of each creation, that's who's singing the song. The third possibility is that it's human beings singing the song. In other words, I'll just use this as an example, like cartoons that take different animals, Bugs Bunny and Donald Duck and whatever, or Aesop's fables, and even in the Midrash where you have animals talking. And these are allegories. These are metaphors that are meant to give over an idea. And so the third idea is that this is what human beings are imagining these creations are singing. And the fourth possibility is it's God who is singing, because just like we say every morning, Baruch she'amar v'haya olam, blessed is the one who spoke and the world came into being. And without a long explanation, there's a further jump where we say that God sang the world into creation. And anyone who has my book, The Mystical Power of Music, so half of the book is basically building this idea that God is singing the world into existence, not just speaking it, but singing it. And this is very connected to the idea of string theory. This is, again, the cutting edge of physics today, which posits that the smallest entities of reality are vibrating strings. And they're actually creating a sort of music. And that music defines what every entity in the physical world is. We are a product of the inner song of the atoms and the particles and the molecules. But the bigger picture, it's God singing the world into creation. So here we come up with 4 different ideas. And all of them, as we usually learn, it's not one or the other. There's a certain level where they're all true and they're all happening at the same time. Now, also, we look at many of the Psalms, and many of the Psalms talk about trees exulting and rivers clapping hands and mountains skipping and the stars and the sun and the moon praising God. In our daily prayers and on Shabbat, we say explicitly that all of the what's called the host of heaven, and it's one level, it's the angels, but the other says that specifically the sun and the moon and the stars are all praising God. And in Maimonides, there is a place where he posits that the planets all have consciousness. They're not just messengers of God, but they also have a certain level of consciousness. So there's one midrash that I want to share with you that is very enigmatic. And again, until recently, we might look at it as very fanciful. But the midrash says like this, that on the 3rd day of creation, so God commanded the trees, just one second, in the language, it says, V'yomer Elokim tadshei ha'aretz desha, and God said, let the earth produce grasses, esev, herbs and weeds, mazria zera, that have within them seed, eitz peri, trees of fruit. So the Midrash explains that the command to trees was that the entire tree should be edible like the fruit, like we know of fruit. And the Midrash says, when it goes on, so it says, that the trees, ve'etz osepri, but when it came to the actual manifestation of God's command, it doesn't say trees that are completely edible. It says trees that produce fruit. So the Midrash picks up on this very subtle difference and says that the trees purposely did not fulfill God's command. And the question is, well, why not? And so there's a very deep idea here, because when Adam is created, it says that God took afar min ha'adama. He took the dust from the earth. Now, there's two words for earth in the creation story. One is aretz, and one is adama. And so adama, of course, are the same letters as Adam, just with a hey on the end. And adama is a feminine word. And from that, we have the idea of what's called Mother Earth. The Adama, because the earth has what's called koach someach, the power of growth. And this is very, very connected to a woman's power to give birth. So Adama is the feminine of Adam. And so going back to the Midrash, so the Midrash says that, as it were, the plants could see in the future that Adam and Chava would eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra, which was a fruit tree. And they, in a sense, wanted to take away some of the blame that they would be the first creations to not do what God says. And so the Midrash says that the trees purposely did not fulfill their command. They made fruit, but the whole tree wasn't edible like fruit. In order to, in a sense, they were, in a sense, sacrificing or mesirut nefesh. They were giving over their whole being to protect Adam and Chava from the full weight of being the first creation to disobey God. So this is an amazing midrash, because here it's positing, in a sense, that the trees had free will, that they could make a decision like this. Now, obviously, this is somewhat allegorical, metaphorical, trying to teach us something, but it's quite fascinating that now the research is showing that maybe plants do have a certain ability. I saw a whole video about research they did, I believe it was in South Africa, that there was it was more like in the desert. So you had trees, but they were somewhat far apart. Okay, the picture got fuzzy for a while. And one of the trees became diseased. And they did with chemical analysis and everything, and they came to the conclusion that this one tree was sending signals through the ground, through the root system, to neighboring trees, warning them that they should, I don't know what they could do, they should be careful or whatever, that there was this disease among the trees. And they did research on that, and that was the conclusion they came up with, that the diseased tree or trees were sending messages to other types of trees in the area to be aware, So it's an amazing midrash that, and it's a very deep connection between Adam and Adamah. In other words, here we have the vegetable kingdom, but here it says in the text that God took from the afar, min ha'adamah, and he created man. And later we have this idea of why Jews bury and why it's such an important thing, because the verse says, from the earth you were taken, and to the earth you will return. So there's a very deep connection between the earth and a human being in general. And of course, this is one of the explanations of the very, very mystical connection between the Jewish people and Eretz Israel. And especially in a Shemitah year, this week's Torah portion is Bahar. It's all about the sabbatical year. And it's all about our reverence and our treating the land as a holy entity. There's another example that I want to bring. And all of this is just to show that since nothing can exist without a spark of God. We'll call it a spark of God. Without the energy of God animating anything, whether it's a stone or water or a tree or a giraffe or a human being, if there was not a divine spark, it could not exist. And since the spark of God is full of soul and consciousness, so on a certain level, everything has different levels of consciousness. And again, I'll point out, it's not necessarily our level of consciousness, but there is a certain level going on. That's why some of these midrashim that seem very, I'll use the word fanciful, of mountains talking and rivers and animals and plants talking and having conversations. There's something deep about it. This is what we called Perek Shira. This we could see in some of the Psalms. And one other thing that it says in the Torah, we say it in the second paragraph of the Shema every day, where it says that if you do according to God's word and you keep the commandments and you do everything that we should, then we'll have plenty and rain in its season, and we'll have all the bounty in the world. But if we do not listen to God, and we do not have a moral, ethical society, and we don't do the mitzvah, it says that God will shut up the rains, and you will not be able to exist on the land. So in one of the parshas, it's either Achrei Mot or Kedoshim. So when it talks about different levels of holiness and acts that lead to holiness and acts that lead to the opposite of holiness, so it says that you can't profane the land. You can't, meaning that we're not talking about environmental here. That's a whole other discussion. But when there's murder and incest and adultery and idol worship in the land of Israel, so the Torah says the land will vomit you out. And it's interesting, it doesn't say God will send you into exile. It says the land will vomit you out. And that is one of the secrets of the Shemitah year. One of the secrets of the Shemitah year is the land also has to have its Shabbat. The land has to have its rest because there's a certain level of soul. And just like human beings have to have rest, and our animals need to rest on Shabbos because we're not allowed to work with them. So everything gets to rest. And the Torah says in this week's parsha, the land has to rest also. So all of this was to look at consciousness and soul in the widest perspective as we can, because after this, we're going to obviously concentrate on the human soul and learn what we can about it. But before we got to that, I thought it was just very interesting to throw out these ideas. And like I said, the Arizal speaks about this idea in different places of his teachings. One last thing before we move on is one of the explanations of Naaseh Adam b'Tzalmenu u'b'Demutenu. Let us make man in our image and our likeness. And so we learn from Rashi, what does it mean? We, who is God speaking to? Let us make. So some say that to the angels, some say it was an inner discussion. There's a midrash says that he was talking to the souls of the tzaddikim that would be in the future, because for God there is no past, present, and future. It's all happening at once. So the future souls of the tzaddikim, he took counsel with them. And one explanation, which we didn't discuss last week, is God was speaking to all the different elements that he was going to, he had already created. It was the sixth day already. So he took counsel with the mineral world, the vegetable world, the animal world. And Adam, in a sense, is a composite. As we learned last week, Adam is the dam of Adam, is the body, is the blood in the body. And that's what we're told when we eat meat, to make it kosher, we have to take the blood out, because the Torah says over and over again, because the nefesh, the soul of the animal, is in the blood. But here it's even an expanded way of understanding the dam, that this is also the dam of Adamah. And so all of creation goes into the creation of mankind. We're what's called the crown of creation, the pinnacle of creation. Okay, now we're going to introduce a subject that we've discussed a number of times in different settings and different contexts. And that is the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, that he gave over from what he learned from what's called an aliyat neshama. He had an elevation of soul. And he was in the presence of the soul of the Mashiach. And the Mashiach taught him certain things. And he gave over a few of these things to his brother-in-law in a very, very famous letter that he wrote. It's really the only written testimony we have from the Baal Shem Tov. Everything else we know came through his students, what he taught. And here, though, he says that every letter has the levels of worlds, souls, and divinity. Worlds, souls, and divinity. In Hebrew, olamot, nishamot, elokut. And on the WhatsApp group today, I'm just trying to think if I did it for today or I'm doing it on Thursday. I included, or I will include, one of the two, more of the background of this idea from the Baal Shem Tov, that everything has, every letter, but everything in the world are letters and sfirot. Those are the building blocks of creation. So the Baal Shem said every letter has worlds, souls, and divinity. So in Rav Ginsburg's book, Anatomy of the Soul, which I mentioned we will be using, and we have been actually, both classes, is his definition of what is the soul. So he connects it very much to this idea of worlds, souls, and divinity. And he says that the soul is the bridge between the experience of the physical world and the experience of the spiritual entity of divinity. In other words, the soul is in the middle. It's the bridge. It's like the ladder in Jacob's dream that was entrenched in the earth, but its head reached the heavens. And then God appeared at the top of the ladder. But the ladder was firmly entrenched in the earth. And the soul is, in a sense, like the angels that were ascending and descending on the ladder. This is also the existential reality of the soul. That the soul, just like we have a soul in the body, and Adam, the Aleph is the soul and the Dam is the body. So the soul is the bridge between the worlds and divinity and godliness. That's how Rav Ginsburg opens up his book, Anatomy of the Soul. And so he explains, for those who have it, in the introduction to the book on the Hebrew letters. So he explains this idea of the soul, of worlds, souls, and divinity more. And that's what I'm going to give over right now. And so he says that, but this is from the perspective of the soul. So on the level of worlds, olamot, the soul's experience is being a creature like any other creature. Now, obviously, we are very egocentric, but in a certain level, we'll even call it the lowest common denominator, we are a creation like any other creation, even though we're unique. But like we said, Na'aseh Adam, God got all of the components of creation together in order to create mankind. So there's a certain level that a human being is aware of all of the world around us. So this is very, very connected to the whole environmental movement, which is, as far as I'm concerned, a Torah imperative to take care of the world that God gave us. But here it's being like aware of the importance of water and clean air and lack of garbage and lack of pesticides that are poisoning everything. In other words, being aware of the world. It's through our prism, through our consciousness, but being aware of the world that we live in and the effects that we have on our world. On the level of soul, so Rav Ginsburg says it's the experience of understanding the soul as being a rectifier, what's called tikkun olam, because we're talking about tikkun olam means the physical material world that we're living in. But here, the soul is conscious of its role of healing, giving, harmonizing, and fixing the world that we live in. And on the level of divinity, the soul longs to be a part of God. And that's why many times the soul is compared to a candle, a flame. That's why we have the verse, Ner Hashem Nishmat Adam. The candle of God is the soul of man. And because of this verse, many times we compare the soul to a candle or a flame. Especially next week is Lag BaOmer. And this is very, very connected to the custom of building bonfires as an expression of the soul's desire to be connected through the mystical teachings of the Torah to the essence of God. Okay, now we're going to go from a different perspective of worlds, souls, and divinity. Actually, I'm looking quickly at one of the chats. I usually try not to, so I don't lose my concentration. But Nahum says, doesn't adameh mean to be like, to resemble? So this is very correct. It was even in my notes, but I skipped over it. There's a pasuk that says, adameh le'elyon. I will resemble God on high. And so it's the same word as adamah. It's the same word as Adam. And it's based on the idea that the human being is created in the image and likeness of God. So here it says, I will envision God, but the word here is adameh, because in Hebrew, the word for imagination is dimayon, which comes from dam. So this is a very, very deep teaching of language, is when the imagination is rectified, then it actually leads to prophecy. The Rambam says this clearly. The Ramchal talks about that. Both of them talk about this at length, the role of imagination in prophecy. But here we're talking about a rectified sense of imagination. When the imagination is not fixed, so then it's dam. Adameh is our lower being draws us down into all kinds of egotistic, many times sexual fantasies driven by our lower soul. Okay, now let's return to world, souls, and divinity. And this is a very, very important one because it just means to remember three words, but it's so meaningful. So Rav Ginsburg says, on the level of worlds, our consciousness is to uplift the world. And we hear this so many times, is that doing mitzvot is taking the physical world and uplifting it to a more spiritual plane. Whether it's any mitzvah or eating or any physical pleasure, that by saying brachas and washing our hands and having the right intent, that we take the physical world and we uplift the world. So that's on the level of worlds. And the key word is uplift. On the level of souls, the key word is connect. So actually, now that I remember, I put on the WhatsApp on Thursday a whole discussion of this level of connection, that the soul connects to other souls. The soul connects to the world. The soul connects to God. And again, it's the bridge. That's the important thing here. It's the bridge that connects the world to higher planes, the physical to the spiritual. And the soul is the rectifier, is the bridge, is the ladder between them. And on the level of divinity, of Elokut, so the soul's purpose or role or desire is to unify. In other words, like we say, the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. The idea of unification is to unify with God, but also to reveal the unity of God in the world. Now, one more, and that is a different way, a different perspective, again, of worlds, souls, and divinity, but here again, through the perspective of the soul's experience of world, souls, and divinity. And that is that in the world, the soul is searching. Because God is very, very hidden. We're searching for meaning. We're searching for reasons that things happening. We're searching for solutions. And we're searching for ways to make it a better world. So here the key word is searching. On the level of souls, the emphasis is on serving. This is what's called being an Eved Hashem, or doing Avodat Hashem, what's called the serving God, where the soul becomes very, very aware that what it's doing in this world is serving God. In other words, all the mitzvot that we do, all the prayers should, in a sense, have this as the background context of everything that we're doing, is that all of our thoughts, speech, and action should be part of our desire to serve God. And in a sense, serve others as well, as being a giver, a rectifier, a connector. And the last thing, again, is on the level of divinity, is being a part of godliness, a part of God. The idea that the soul is an actual part of God above, and being in the image of God. So I'm just going to say this over again. We have 3 triplets here, but these single words can teach us so much. So again, being aware of being a creature on the level of worlds, being aware of being a rectifier on the level of souls, and to be part of godliness on the level of divinity. And then we have in the worlds, we want to lift up the worlds that the world should ascend. And then on the level of souls, that we connect. And on the level of divinity, we unify. And the last triplet is that in this world, we're searching. On the level of souls, we are serving. And on the level of divinity, we are unifying with God. So now I want to end with one more thing. Just give me 1 second. And this is connected to Sfirat HaOmer. This is connected to this time of year. And when we count the Omer every evening, so afterwards, after we say the blessing and count the day, there's different readings, different intents. And the final one is like this. I'm going to read it, and we're going to connect it to worlds, souls, and divinity. This is also a Torah from Rav Ginsburg. So it says like this: Uvechein yehi ratzon lefanecha Hashem Elokeinu ve'Elokei Avotenu. And therefore, may it be your will, God, our God, and God of our fathers, shebeschut Sfirat HaOmer shesefarti hayom, that on the merit of the Sfirat HaOmer that I have counted today, Yitukan mash shepagamti b'sfirat, and then you put in whatever it is, Chesed sheba Gevura, Gevura sheba Teferet, Malchut sheba Yesod. We fill in the Sfirot of the day. Now this is what I want to get to. V'yet taher v'yet kadesh b'kedusha shemala. In order that we should purify, we should be purified and become holy in your higher holiness. V'al yedei zeh, and through this, yushpa shefer rav b'chol ha'olamot, and through counting the Omer, having the kavanah, and wanting to purify ourselves and to become holy. So through this, we should draw down a great bounty, B'kol ha'olamot, in all of the worlds. So here Rav Ginsburg says this is the level of olamot, of the worlds. And it's really not just this mitzvah Sfirat Omer. What we're reading here in a certain way applies to all of the mitzvah. But here it's in the language specifically of counting the Omer. And through doing this mitzvah, we're drawing down shefa, bounty, spiritual energy, spiritual light into all of the worlds. And then it says, Ulatakein et nafshotenu, beruchatenu, benishmatenu. In order that we should be able to fix our nefesh, our ruach, and our neshama. So this obviously is the level of neshamot. So we had olamot, fixing, drawing shaf into all of the worlds. And here we're having to fix all these different levels of soul. And then it continues, and we should fix our soul, mikol sigu pagam, from all type of impurity and blemish, ula taharenu ula kachenu, and to become pure and holy, bekedushat ha ha'elyona. That's the elokut, in your higher kedusha. This is the level of elokut. Amen, Selah. So this is what we read every evening after counting Sfirat Omer. But the point here is we just started to learn about the idea of worlds, souls, and divinity. And the important point is the soul is in the middle. It's the bridge between the physical and the spiritual, between finite and infinite, between body and the godly soul, between God and creation. The soul is the intermediary in a sense. It is the ladder. And so here we see beautifully this idea. And like I said, it could be applied to any mitzvah. Any mitzvah we're doing, we want to draw down light and energy into the world to make it a better world. Like we just learned, to be a rectifier of the worlds, to connect to the worlds, and to fix our nefeshes, our ruach, and our neshama, and that we should become pure in God's B'kedushatcha ha'elyona. Okay, so that's where we're going to end tonight. We'll end with a bracha that we should keep this in mind, that everything that we do is in a sense to try to connect worlds, souls, and divinity, and connect them together. One more second. And in a certain way, so this really is the secret of the Aleph, where you have here, this is Elokut, divinity. This is Olamot. And in a sense, this is Neshamot. This is the soul that connects God to the world.